I think you should have done question 11 plus some, but let's see how you did. Again, the quick check is just a graph in your calculator compared to your graph. And that doesn't check some stuff like domain and holes, but if your graph looks different, then you definitely know something's wrong. Okay, so y-intercepts are when x is 0. So if you plugged in 0 for x's everywhere, you were left with 0 divided by 8, which would be 0. For these three, we need to know the numbers that make the numerator 0. And the denominator 0, which implies some factoring. Any number that makes both the numerator and the denominator 0 is how you get a whole. Any number that just makes the numerator 0 is an x-intercept. And any number that makes just the denominator 0 is a vertical asymptote. So 3 answers very quick. Okay, so domain, we can plug in every x value we want to as long as it doesn't divide by 0. So I get to reuse this information. We can't plug in 2, but we can plug in everything less than 2 and everything more than 2. Okay, horizontal asymptotes, the one where we have to compare the degrees. Since the degree of the numerator was bigger, that's when you don't have a horizontal asymptote. If the degree of the denominator had been bigger, it would have been y equals 0. And if the degrees had been equal, we would have put leading coefficient over leading coefficient, so negative 1/4. But this one, no. Slant asymptote is where we have to do long division and ignore the remainder, but only if it has one. And so only if the degree of the numerator is 1 bigger than the degree of the denominator, which this one does have that. So we do have to take a minute to long divide that denominator into the numerator. So it looks like we need a negative 1/4, because a negative times a negative gives you a positive. 1/4 times 4 gives you 1, and x times x gives you x squared. Also multiply it to 8. A negative times a positive is negative. 1/4 times 8 would be 2. Multiplying by a 4th is the same as dividing by 2. And x times no more x's would be x. Change the signs before you forget and add. And then do it again if you can. So it looks like we can here, because negative 1 times negative 4x gives us positive 4x. Also multiply by 8. Change the signs and add. Now the remainder is important, it's just not important in slant asymptotes. So we get to ignore the remainder. This is the equation of your slant asymptote, just the quotient piece. So long division, ignore remainder. Okay, if we start to throw all of this into our graph, 0, 0 is the y-intercept, 0, 0 and negative 2, 0 are the x-intercepts. Asymptotes need to be graphed as dashed lines, including the slant asymptote, which is in mx plus b format. So y-intercept is negative 1, slope of negative 1/4. And so if you got those parts right and applied them to the graph correctly, this is where you should be. So the last part of graphing is knowing how it interacts around slant asymptotes and horizontal asymptotes, knowing how it interacts around vertical asymptotes, and then potentially plotting some more points if we feel like we need it. So what we're supposed to know about slant and horizontal is that how it approaches the far left of the graph and far right of the graph. So of course I know these 2 points need to be connected, and then it's got to approach the slant asymptote. Now based on the direction of my graph here, I can tell it's going to go up on this side, so down on this side, because that always happens with vertical asymptotes. And then it needs to approach the slant asymptote on the right as well. So as it gets close to that, he's got to turn the corner because he can't cross it. He can't cross it at the end of the graph. He could have crossed it in the middle of the graph if it had more sections, but it should look like that. Now, even though I think my graph's pretty accurate without any points, again, you're certainly encouraged to plug in more points. If you plugged in x equals 1, it looks like it should be about 1. So if you plug in 1 and you get an answer of -4, then you need to rethink some of your work. Something's off. But I'll just go ahead and do my 1. I would get 3/4, which is pretty close to 1. So actually, I guess I could even make my graph just a tiny bit more accurate if I updated that point. But the point is that the point is about where I expected it to be. It wasn't somewhere radically different. So that adds some confidence. So consider adding more points if you were not confident in your graph. Okay, anything that quickly jumps out at y'all about this question? Any of it that I was flying through too fast?